Marriage is often viewed as a very personal thing, but a relevant public policy question is, does government have a role promoting or even trying to strengthen marriage?
The goal is to strengthen Utah families proactively so that we get better outcomes for our kids and we save money in social service costs and everything else.
A growing body of evidence shows that strong families anchored by healthy marriages can actually be one of the biggest drivers of upward mobility and long-term success for the next generation. So we sit down with experts who are leading marriage and family initiatives right here in Utah. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the importance of families, specifically marriage and two-parent households with respect to how they affect outcomes for kids. And we're talking with a couple of experts and leaders on that issue here in Utah. I'm joined this week by, we'll start with you, Dr. Brian Higginbotham, who's the Associate Vice President for USU Extension, and Dr. Alan Hawkins, the manager for the Utah Marriage Commission. Both of you gentlemen, thanks so much for being here on Defending Ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to start out to frame the conversation. We here at Sutherland, of course, have been doing a lot of work around family issues for a long time, and recently have really started to dive into how can we help to support and strengthen Utah's families, recognizing all of the things that correlates with as far as other outcomes for kids and just outcomes for society at large. But I want to start with kind of addressing anyone who might feel skeptical about why the government is getting involved in this stuff in the first place, specifically with respect to marriage. And so I want to read a couple of brief quotes from a book called The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Carney, where she talks about, as she kind of got into this issue about marriage and family structure with respect to kids. So she tells a story where she attended a gathering of policy experts and scholars where they're talking about all these different things that impact how kids do later in life. And she poses the question to them, well, what about family? What about family structure and family stability and things like that? Her response from kind of how she gauged the room was, the consensus I took from the room was that family and marriage were personal matters and somewhat out of bounds for this type of discussion. She goes on to say, people in these types of scholarly, policy-oriented settings are much more comfortable talking about the need to improve schools, expand college access, and increase the earned income tax credit than they are talking about family structure and how kids are raised. Again, that's from The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Carney. Just came out recently. It's creating a lot of attention around these issues. So with those quotes to kind of help frame it, I want to ask both of you, and maybe Brian, let's start with you. Does the government have a role in promoting marriage?
Yeah. The government gives out the licenses for people to marry. So whether people think the government should be involved or not, they currently are. The extent to which they should either promote or make it more difficult for people to get in or out of marriage, I think is an open discussion, and one that, we'll discuss here today, and there's a lot of good research on. But I think one of the reasons why the government is involved is because people aspire to having relationships, and the majority of Americans aspire to having a long-term committed relationship that in many cases is going to be in the form of marriage. And so it takes resources, though, to provide those kinds of experiences, trainings, certifications, workshops that provide people the knowledge and skills that they're seeking. But I can tell you from the analytics that we do with the searching that people do for resources, how to have a strong relationship, how to improve my marriage, are on the forefront of most people's minds.
And I'd go a little bit. I think I'd go even farther than that. I think there's a case to be made that there's a decaying infrastructure of something very fundamental in our society, in the same way that we're worrying about bridges that are about to collapse, and worry as we think towards the future about full access to the technology that we need. we worry about that kind of infrastructure. Even, the educational system that we have, is it really functioning the way that an advanced economy needs? And as Dr. Carney makes a strong case for, and as I think many, many people have come to understand, the social infrastructure, and especially our families, is a really important part. And I think there's an argument to be made that we should be carefully considering what we can do to strengthen that infrastructure, to rebuild that infrastructure. I'm of the opinion that we can do smart things and we can do dumb things, and that we ought to be doing smart things. I'm also saying that in the context of, I worry terribly, along with a few other people in this country, that we're running massive budget deficits and we don't have all the resources that we need. So we have to be smart, we have to be careful. But I do think that there's a strong sense of something that's decaying, that's going to make it more difficult for us to have a civil society and a strong economy. And if you want to add one other thing to that, there's just, I think, a fairness component. People want strong families. And the vast majority of people want a strong, stable, lasting, healthy marriage. And it may be, as a matter of fact, the research is showing that it's not everyone seems able to access that. And so a sense of fairness, of helping people understand what it takes to build healthy relationships and stronger marriages, could be something that the government could help do.
Alan, you wrote about this recently for the Deseret News in an op-ed where you talk about the 25-year commemoration of the creation of the Utah Marriage Commission, and you kind of address in that piece this big question of why should the government even be involved in the first place? Brian acknowledging that it already is, but I guess why should it be involved in maybe areas that people traditionally have felt uncomfortable about? And there's a line you use, Alan. You actually posed the question in your piece at Deseret News, and we'll include it in the show notes. Should the government be extending its impersonal reach into such personal matters? But you say yes.
I do think it's a very important question. And again, I think there are smarter and dumber ways to do that. But and I'll fall back on what Governor Leavitt, former Governor Leavitt, said at the event, our celebration of our 25th anniversary for the Utah Marriage Commission. He said, those of us who have been involved in state government get a real strong feeling for how expensive it is when basic family functions are not done well, and the government is legally required to step in, or it picks up the costs associated with children not being raised in the way that we would hope that families would. And we all struggle to have. None of us has perfect families, but there are those that need more help. And it's the old adage: it ought to be cheaper and better to build that fence at the top of the cliff than to fund more ambulances at the bottom of the cliff.
Brian, thinking about that 25-year recognition, so the Utah Marriage Commission been around for 25 years. Help to articulate for our listeners why the state needs that, and why even in Utah of all places, because we look at some of the rates of these kinds of things in Utah. We have a higher rate of children being raised in married two-parent households. Then I'll have to reference the exact stat, but we have really high rates here in Utah of these kinds of things. So why does Utah need a Utah Marriage Commission? And kind of from your lens overseeing this effort through USU Extension, why is USU Extension the right place for this? Yeah,
the statistics are indicating that marriage is declining, nationwide, and Utah's actually part of that. Utah is not all that different from other states in terms of its divorce rates. And so although there is, a cultural proclivity towards marriage, we don't have any kind of we're not winning awards for, having the best marriages than anywhere else in the world. We have our own struggles. And so, what marriage commissions do, and Utah's not unique in having efforts to support marriages and two-parent families. Other states have done them as well. It coalesces people around a common cause. The Marriage Commission is currently constituted as now that it's being hosted at Utah State University is a very broad and diverse group that includes individuals who think about things like mental health, that are keenly aware of domestic violence, who represent businesses and education. And so it provides a forum for individuals who care about something to come together and to try to move the needle in making individuals aware of resources. And I should just say that, as the land-grant university, we aren't trying to promote any one particular type of marriage. We have resources for individuals who are, remarrying. We have individuals who are in same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relationships. For us, the focus has been on what are the skills needed to have a strong, stable relationship. We allow the politicians and the churches and individuals to decide who they marry. But if they are going to choose to get married, we want them to provide the best experience for their partner and have the best experience for themselves, and to provide the best kind of parenting if they bring children into that relationship.
I want to ask the question in another way and get both of your takes on this. So in my case, I got married a few years back. My wife and I have 2 little boys now, and they're wonderful, and it's the best part of life, truly. But if someone is a little bit skeptical, saying, okay, well, if I think of my marriage or my family, why does the state government care if, my marriage is healthy and happy and strong? I, of course, care deeply about it. My family cares deeply about it. But I want to frame that with another reference. So here at Sutherland Institute, we recently published a paper called The Utah Family Miracle. It's a joint paper between us and Institute for Family Studies. And in there, the paper references another expert named Raj Chetty, who's a Harvard economist who's done a lot of work on upward mobility specifically. And this is what the Utah Family Miracle points out from Raj Chetty's work. It says, quote, Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues found that the Salt Lake City metro area has some of the highest rates of economic mobility for poor children across America. One key reason for that finding is that the region has more two-parent families than other metro areas across the nation. And now the paper quotes Raj Chetty directly and says, the strongest and most robust predictor of children's economic mobility is the fraction of children with single parents. So when I couple my question of, hey, why do you guys care how my marriage is doing, with those findings on upward mobility, is it safe to say that not just in my own household, but in my neighborhood and my community, the percentage of married two-parent households that are raising kids actually matters a great deal for the community's success?
Yeah, because marriage is deeply personal, but it is also very clearly a public good, and a part of our social infrastructure that's very important. And I would just echo our current Governor Spencer Cox's comments about this. He doesn't want to take. He acknowledges that strong families in Utah is a really important asset that they have, but he doesn't want to take it for granted. And just assume that it's going, especially as Brian said, is that like much of the nation, some of those indicators are heading down. Our marriage rate is decreasing, and it's decreasing fairly rapidly. Our divorce rate remains higher than average, or in that average range, but it's certainly not something to write home about. And for those reasons, I think we should care about marriage personally, but we need to be concerned about our neighbor's marriage as well.
So, please go ahead.
Just maybe 2 points. One, when I get asked this question, I ask people, well, would you prefer that your tax dollars, yours, mine, would you rather them go towards child support enforcement, to divorce lawyer, to divorce courts, not maybe the lawyers, but, maybe to the public defenders or the court staff, or would you rather those dollars go towards pick what you want it to go towards, education, anything, better road? I mean, I don't care what, but there's a limited number of tax dollars. And when there are relationships, married or unmarried, that bring children into this world, that don't stick together, there are financial consequences to a state in terms of separating the union, deciding who gets the child, enforcing those arrangements. Those are real costs that are borne by all of us as taxpayers. And so if we can spend some resources on trying to help relationships, learn the skills, and for people to have the knowledge needed to either not get into a relationship that's going to be bad, to learn some, what the red flags are, and or to help individuals who maybe are hitting a rough patch learn the skills needed to work through those, we actually save money in the long run for taxpayers that can be used on other things.
So there's a preventative factor.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do is prevent those problems or prevent them from getting worse. Providing those sound research-based programs and educational resources that will help them get where they want to go. And, I think it's also very important that a state signals what it thinks is important and helps people get access to the resources so that they can have success in their life.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to ask you both to give some examples of the kinds of things that are happening here in Utah, from the Utah Marriage Commission, from Healthy Relationships Utah. Essentially, what are the interventions, what works well, and kind of build that out a little bit for our listeners so they understand, okay, it's one thing to say, yes, the state has a role. It's another thing to say, here's what that role should look like. So I want to get into some of those details. But before we go to that break, I want to ask you this question. What pushback do you both see here in Utah or elsewhere about even the notion of the state caring or being involved with marriage and family stability here in Utah? And maybe another way to approach that is, are there people who still need convincing that, yes, there's a public interest in the health and stability of marriage and families, especially as it relates to children? So what's the pushback you're getting? And what's the way to appropriately persuade people that this is something we all should care about?
There is certainly pushback. And by the way, we get it from both the left and the right for somewhat different reasons. The left being more concerned about, are you pushing one particular kind of family structure and stigmatizing others, which we really feel strongly we do not do. And the right being concerned about, government getting too involved in personal matters and maintaining, as much of that personal freedom. So that pushback is there, but I think we've found a good way to do it, providing voluntary educational resources available to all at no or free or very minimal costs. Having these resources being strong research-based, not just anyone's opinions, and so that our resources are going to support those kinds of efforts. Rather than, a more pushy kind of style of doing things. I don't know. What would you add to that?
Yeah, Brian, is this the right style? Here's the resources. We welcome everyone to take advantage of them. Is that what's going to help persuade more folks that, yes, there is a public interest here?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I didn't really like cheesecake until I tried it, and then I found that I really enjoyed it. And so I think to some degree, philosophically, people are going to agree or disagree on the role of government. And I would invite them to, listen to one of our podcasts. It's free. It's not going to cost them anything. And, see if it helps your relationship. And if it does, hopefully you'll share it with somebody else. And so we're really not pushy. We're really trying just to help individuals have access to good information. And so to answer your initial question, I get asked the same questions from across the political spectrum. And my answer is typically the same to both, and that is, where else are people going to go to learn about healthy relationships if they don't have access to that, maybe from their own parents? Maybe their parents didn't have healthy relationships. Well, they're certainly not going to find it on TV. depending on if they're religious or not. They may or may not hear it from their congregation.
And the young adults these days are less religious and not depending as much on that institution for help.
So we often say, as we think about success sequencing and trying to help kids maximize their opportunity for success, we don't teach a lot of this in public high schools. So again, if they're not getting it at home, and if they're not getting it in, extracurricular activities or religious settings or wherever else, where else are they going to get it? And I think that's what we have tried to provide, is a non-pushy, voluntary space for individuals who choose for themselves to learn more about relationships, to be able to have access it in a way that's not cost prohibitive.
I would
stretch it just one degree further. I think having healthy relationships is a learning, growing, lifelong process, even for those who started with a pretty strong base. We run into issues that are hard to deal with, and there's good help for those kinds of things. So as just a basic a kind of piece of our social infrastructure, knowing that there are good resources to help me deal with, wow, I've got a new issue coming up, a new need, a new challenge that's out there, I think we can help.
Well, that's a good place to break, and we'll come back, and I want to get into some of those details more. You also mentioned the success sequence. I'll ask you about that, and then kind of, again, flesh out a little bit the what and the how. What is the actual appropriate way to advance these ideas? So stick around. You're listening to Defending Ideas with Brian Higginbotham and Alan Hawkins, talking about all the great work they're doing with USU Extension on the Utah Marriage Commission and Healthy Relationships Utah. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Brian Higginbotham and Alan Hawkins from USU Extension, specifically the Utah Marriage Commission and Healthy Relationships Utah. We're going to get back into some of the details of what they do and how they do it to help strengthen marriages and other relationships here in Utah. But first, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode and previous shows that you can use in your conversations with friends and family about the ideas that we discuss on this podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms. Just go to wherever you like to get your podcasts, type in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and click subscribe. That's defendingideas.org. Brian and Alan, I want to get into some of the details about what you guys do, what the Marriage Commission does, what Healthy Relationships Utah does, and also how it's done. So maybe, Brian, starting with you, kind of with your lens of in this leadership role with USU Extension, talk to us about what's sort of the landscape of resources offered to Utahns, and how are you guys able to deliver that?
Yeah, thank you. So very little state dollars actually come to these initiatives. The support that comes with the name in many ways is branding, right? It shows that Utah is in favor and in support of strengthening families. But there's not a state line appropriation that comes to the Utah Marriage Commission. Rather, there's some TANF dollars, which stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And of course, some of the main objectives of TANF, as written in federal law, is to support two-parent families and to help prevent out-of-wedlock childbearing. And so some of those dollars are routed to us for some of these programs. And then the state several years ago passed a law that allows individuals to get a discount on their marriage license if they take premarital education. And a small portion of those marriage licenses then comes to the Utah Marriage Commission. So we're talking about very small dollars. However, with those small dollars, we're able, as an institution, to then leverage those to go for external dollars, matches, donations. Right now, we have close to $4 million that are coming in from from federal grants and contracts to support very specific programs for different audiences. And so it's really probably one of the best returns on investment, just from a financial perspective, for states to be involved, because it shows they have skin in the game. And if our state doesn't have skin in the game, then some of those external funders decide to give their money to other places. But they know Utah cares about families. So let me give you a couple of examples. We have a multi-year, multi-million-dollar grant right now that supports fathers being more engaged in their children's lives, with a focus on men who have been or who are currently incarcerated. We have another multi-year, multi-million-dollar project that supports step families, individuals who are remarrying for a second or third time and who want it to be better. And, as I mentioned before about how people want these kinds of things, I often refer to the old adage, remarriage represents the triumph of hope over experience. They've had a bad experience, or in some cases a traumatic experience, but they want this next time around to be beautiful and wonderful. And so our classes, which are, a 12-hour, usually broken down into 6 2-hour, date night kind of experiences, people come and they learn about how to communicate, how to connect with the stepchild, how to navigate the challenges that come when you have children going back and forth to different households, or if you have an ex-partner who's still, requiring time, energy, and resources. We have another project that is supported by the Office of Population Affairs back in Washington, D.C., that is really focused at-risk youth who right now are not tracking in that success sequence, right? They in many cases are not coming from homes that are intact. In many cases, they've been taken out of their homes, or they are been involved in significant acts of deviance, truancy, etc. We're trying to give them an opportunity to reset. In many cases, they were not exposed and do not have models of healthy relationships. And so we use a program, again, multiple hours, where we go into juvenile justice centers, into alternative high schools, in partnership with mental health clinics around the state. And we help teach these youth how to identify what is a healthy relationship and what's not. Kind of sequencing, pacing those relationships so that they understand that you don't have to have, sex on your first date in order to be able to, keep this guy or girl around that you're interested in, how to communicate, how to spot those red flags before you find yourself pregnant with somebody's baby that you don't know their name or who doesn't want anything else to do with you. We have other programs that are in partnership with our Department of Workforce Services that help individuals who have either lost their jobs or who are trying to improve their job skills by teaching them relationship skills, how to get along with the people in their office, how to manage the stress that comes with having this family life on the outside, or a desire to have a family life on the outside but having a busy work schedule. We teach parenting classes that help individuals work together as a couple, or if for whatever reason they're single parents, how to successfully navigate the challenges of being a good, successful parent.
I want to pinpoint something, Brian, and then Alan, I want to get your perspective on kind of the broader lens of marriage initiatives from a policy standpoint that has worked, and maybe things we should be looking at here or other states should look at. But Brian, you mentioned the success sequence a couple times, and one of the things I've noticed when that issue is discussed publicly is that it seems like there's often sort of a pushback of, and what I view as a correct pushback is we cannot or should not just go into the communities where these young people are and just quote unquote preach the success sequence alone and say, hey, here is a data-driven series of steps. Finish your high school education, work a full-time job, and if you're going to have kids, get married first. If you do that, you got a 97% chance of not being in poverty. The data is very powerful, but if all we were doing was going in and just sort of telling people about it and saying, well, we gave it to you, now it's up to you to do it, and then not bringing sort of the institutional supports to help make it feel more attainable for young people, then we're not doing it in the right way. And it sounds like I would sort of classify everything you just described in that third bucket of, if we're trying to help encourage people that here's a good set of life milestones, the how do I accomplish it question in that third bucket of marriage and family, you guys are helping to answer. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. And we do so with, live classes, but we do it with an enormous amount of online material that they can access on demand for free. at any time and on a wide range of topics. And I do think that, again, there's a certain amount of fairness involved here, that there are many who really have not had the models, which is such an important way for us to learn. And in those situations, yeah, we do need to have their backs, I think, with appropriate education. You're right. The preaching just doesn't go very far, but setting out the model and then giving them a little bit of help as they need it along the way, I think that's a workable model.
And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it or promote it in the right way and in the right context, but it's the first step. Essentially saying, here is a set of life milestones that data shows correlate with in general, really good outcomes in adulthood. That's good. We should promote it and talk about it. But then say, okay, how can we help remove barriers for people who maybe struggle to achieve it or don't see it modeled? And that's one thing I wanted to ask you about as well, Alan, is with respect to either marriage specifically or even just family in general, what are policy initiatives, essentially what works really well? Either stuff that you folks are doing right now at the Marriage Commission or with Healthy Relationships Utah. Do you have good outcomes to show, hey, when we do these kinds of things, these kinds of educational interventions, it actually does move the needle, and here's how? Or are there other examples of what actually works to strengthen and support healthy marriages and families here in Utah and elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks. For 25 years, I've had my head in this space academically, and I think there is a pretty strong case to be made now that these educational interventions, we're not talking therapy, we're not talking counseling. This providing people with knowledge and skills that will help them can be learned, can be kept, and can make a difference in terms of the quality of our relationship and the stability of our relationship. Dramatic results on average? No. I think for a few people, the light really goes on. This is exactly what they need, and it's dramatic. But on average, we do see positive results, and there's a strong body of research now supporting that. There is certainly a question of so how do you broaden that? How do you disseminate that via policy? And I think the reality is we haven't had a whole lot of experimentation with that. And I don't think there's any question but right now, but what Utah is providing the premier leadership in trying to figure that out. And while we have a long ways to grow, I think we've got a pretty good working model, as Brian said, is one that's a pretty strong positive investment. It's low cost with high yield.
As we finish up, I want to maybe close with this question, because a big point of this podcast for our listeners is to equip them as they go out and have conversations with friends, family, coworkers, neighbors about all the issues we deal with in the state and in this country. How can we equip our listeners to be better champions of the principle of family is really, really important for a whole range of outcomes in our state and in our country, and it's something that should be central to our public discussions about policy interventions, cultural responses, institutional supports. So maybe I'll start with you, Alan, and then Brian, give you the last word. How do we equip the folks listening to go and articulate that family should be the center of virtually everything we talk about in the realm of politics and public policy? And if that's too dramatic of a goal, rein me in a little bit, but what would you say?
I think the evidence is strong that strong civil societies, strong economies need a really good functioning social infrastructure, and that the key to that are strong families. There can be strong families in many different varieties, but we know statistically that that two-parent married family, especially one where they're paying attention to the relationship and learning and growing and getting better and then passing that on to the next generation, where you have generations and generations of this. That's what's going to create the kind of civil society that we want. And I think there's a meta message in all these educational resources that we are offering them to help them strengthen their relationships. And that meta message is these things don't come naturally. We need to work on them. We need to learn. We need to grow, just like we do in any other important aspect of life. And so if we don't accomplish anything else, and I think we do, I think we're sending a strong message that's the mindset we need, learning and growing.
Brian, what would you add to that? How do we equip our listeners to be champions of this idea of the centrality of strong, stable, healthy families to everything else we would hope to see in a healthy society?
Well, let me answer it this way. I think those conversations can go without a hitch when you're in an echo chamber. But when you're talking with somebody who has been through a divorce or who maybe is a child of divorce, it's going to be a harder sell to talk about that in a way that they come away as a believer of that being, universally true. And so I have found that talking about success sequencing is a good way to talk about the research, but to also to be able to articulate what are those components and talk about success components. And it may be that somebody is outside of that sequence, but that doesn't mean that they still can't learn some of the components and apply them later on. And that's why we do teach classes for individuals who are going through a divorce or who are going through a remarriage or who are in the foster care system, because we want them to be successful too. In many cases, they didn't bring it upon themselves or ask for those to be outside of that sequence. And so I have found that in my conversation, most people believe in wanting to have healthy families. How they're going to get there or what that might look like may be different. But at the end of the day, all of them, regardless of the sequence, are going to have these same core components of respect, of communication, of trust. And that's what we, at the end of the day, are trying to teach, at least.
And they need hope.
And they need hope
for many
to believe that it's possible.
To believe that it's possible. And I think that's one thing that we can do on our website and in our classes is be strong hope mongers. That this isn't a secret. This isn't something beyond your capability. It may be you may have to reach farther than others. That's true. But there's basic knowledge, fundamental skills, and attitudes that you can implement to achieve to get to where you want to be.
Sometimes I have to kind of prod folks to say, hey, end on an optimistic note, but in this case, you guys took care of it yourselves. Being hope mongers or champions of hope that something like this is possible in personal lives and for our state and country as a whole. So thank you both so much for lending your time and expertise, joining us and talking through these issues and all the wonderful things you're doing with USU Extension and the Marriage Commission and Healthy Relationships Utah. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to take one more quick break, and we'll be right back after this. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. To continue our conversation, we're going to sit down now with Aimee Winder-Newton, who's a senior advisor to Utah Governor Spencer Cox and also the director of the Utah Office of Families. But before we continue the conversation, I want to briefly mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode, and you can subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. Aimee, thanks so much for joining us again on Defending Ideas.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we just spoke with Alan Hawkins and Brian Higginbotham, who are up at USU Extension over the Utah Marriage Commission and Healthy Relationships Utah. But I wanted to bring you in to help round out the conversation and give kind of the state leadership level perspective, in particular with your role with the governor's administration over the Utah Office of Families. We've had you on this podcast before and talked a lot about what you're trying to do through that office. But I want to start off asking you essentially the same question I asked to Brian and Alan. Help equip our listeners if they're talking with somebody who's skeptical about government even being involved in this kind of stuff. How would we answer the question, does the government have an interest in promoting marriage?
Yeah, well, I would say to answer that, absolutely. This is one of the reasons why Governor Cox started the Office of Families last year. The goal is to strengthen Utah families proactively so that we get better outcomes for our kids and we save money in social service costs and everything else. Well, part of that strengthening of families and creating stability, marriage is a big, important piece of that. And so, first of all, what it does is we've seen the data. We know that children who have intact families, who have two parents, they do better. They have better upward mobility. They fare better in educational level. There's so many things that are provided there. Financially, when you have two people raising a child, there's some strength and stability there. And so marriage has so many benefits for our kids, but it also has benefits for the individuals who are married. So Nick, I've got a list here that I want to share with you that I thought was interesting, just some data that I found. So men who are married live nearly 10 years longer than their unmarried peers, are less likely than singles to suffer from long-term chronic illnesses or disabilities. They drink about half as much as their unmarried peers of the same age, make significantly more money than bachelors, report less depression, less anxiety, and lower levels of other psychological distress than singles, and are about 3 times less likely to die by suicide than those who are unmarried. That's for men. And
I'm assuming it goes both ways. That
yes,
there's
absolutely.
a lot of benefits of this for men, but also for women in marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the list for women. Married women have a 50% lower mortality rate than their non-married peers. Being unmarried shortens a woman's lifespan by more years than would being married and having cancer or living in poverty. Single women are 4 more likely to experience violence by men than are married women. Married women have far higher household incomes than single, divorced, or widowed women. And marriage provides women with access to private health insurance. 83% of married women have private health insurance compared to just over half of divorced or never married women. So those are huge, important stats that we as government care about because we want to have healthy people living in our state. We want to have healthy families. It costs taxpayers so much more when we have people who, are suffering from poverty or mental health issues or these other ailments. And, we've talked a lot lately about human connectedness and how important that is for mental health. There was some research during the pandemic that showed that married couples fared through the pandemic much better with their mental health than those who were not married.
So it sounds like you're pinpointing something that I think has sort of implicitly come up in a lot of these conversations. It seems that most of the time that I've seen, at least when we talk about marriage, it's usually sort of filtered through the benefit for kids.
Right.
That when it comes to upward mobility, there is perhaps no greater driver of upward mobility and success for young people than being raised in a healthy, happy, stable, married 2-parent household. But do you think there's maybe more of a need to, yes, acknowledge that, and in some ways that's should be the focus because the next generation is something we want to prioritize, but also do we need to be willing to talk more about the benefits of marriage just for its own sake for the adults? I mean, the stats that you read the list, that the data is overwhelming and growing about the impact of marriage. But do we need to broaden the discussion a little bit where it's not just about kids, it's also about, marriage is really good for the next generation if they're raised in a 2-parent household. It's also really good for the adults. Do you think that gets missed in our public discussions too often?
I do. And I think it's so strange because in a lot of cases, when we want to talk about marriage and how it's so important, you get some people who say, don't talk about it. You're going to shame single parents or people who are unmarried or whatever. And we want to value everyone's choices. Well, that's true. But the data is clear. It's like saying, we shouldn't talk about education if somebody's parents didn't go to college because we don't want them to feel bad they didn't go to college. No, that's not how we should be looking at things. We need to look at the data and say, okay, this is clearly giving people an advantage. It's making them fare better in life. And we want that. We want all of our Utahns to be successful. Governor Cox wants successful families and, truly believes that marriage is one of the key components of that.
One of the things in our conversation earlier in this episode with Brian and Alan with the Utah Marriage Commission is kind of this idea that when various challenges arise in life that lead to things that create a need for social services programs, for criminal justice interventions, any of these kinds of things when you talk about poverty or mental illness, or just kind of run down the list of societal challenges that we have to face. Government, of course, has an interest and an obligation in many of those instances to try and help address those situations. But they were articulating that, well, if government sort of has to be involved at the back end, then of course it makes sense that government has an interest in the front end. Now, how we do that is nuanced and important, but at least articulating the case that, yes, of course, there's a state interest in healthy, stable marriages and healthy, strong families. Would you agree? Is that kind of the right way to look at there's the back end versus the front end?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime we're seeing taxpayers having to bear the burden of something that's happening in our society, we always want to look at the front end. We always want to look proactively upstream, if you will, to see what is preventing this from getting the outcomes that we need here. And we want to fix it. We want to look at that. It's usually far less expensive to look at it in an upstream manner than it is to try to fix the ailments that may come from issues that we have later. So yeah, I would agree.
Well, one of the other things we mentioned with Alan and Brian was one of the books that's creating a lot of momentum around this issue is The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Carney. I think we've talked about her and her work before. But it's interesting that she sort of positions herself as someone on the center left. She's an economist. She works at Brookings, also at the University of Maryland. And so her approach to this issue, she says, look, I'm approaching this as an economist. So do you think that there's kind of a landscape shift on the issue of how we as a society talk about family issues, family policy, and marriage, where we can recognize that it doesn't have to be sort of this ideological prism that's the only way we look at this, that there's a lot of evidence and data. There's sort of this consensus on both sides, the center right and center left, almost this groundswell movement of the recognition of how important families are. Is that tracking with what you're seeing? And does this feel like a unique moment, not just in our state, but in our country, to be able to center more and more of our public dialogue on the importance of healthy, strong families, ideally in married two-parent households?
Yeah, and I hope we're getting to a point now where we can talk about it more, because in 2019 in the U.S., we hit an all-time low in marriage rates. And you look at here in our state where, man, we're one of the best states for marriages, and we see so many, but we're also seeing a lot fewer people get married. And so we get concerned with that. I mean, the population replacement rate is one place that we get concerned. We want people to be married and before they have children, and yet we need people to have children so that our economy continues to thrive. And that's important too. I will tell you, one of the things that I think is the most compelling data point for why we should people should take a harder look at the value of marriage is what it means for our overall happiness. So recently there was some research with the University of Chicago, and their research indicated that for both men and women, marriage is the most important differentiator of who is happy in America. That's over money, education, race, geography. Being married helps people to be happier in their life. And of course, there's some situations where that's not the case. And we get that. Like, I feel like it's a great blessing that I have a spouse who takes, is an equal partner, and that we have a great marriage. And I get it. Not everybody has that luxury, but that's at least something we should be striving for.
Well, it sounds like with that comment, I mean, there's a lot of debate in our society around a lot of those variables you mentioned. Of course, educational attainment, issues around race and ethnicity have also been, points that have flared up in debate about policy interventions over time, especially in recent years. But do you think it's safe to say that society would benefit and our kids would benefit, but all of us, adults included, would benefit if we could shift more of the emphasis in our public dialogue to the importance and the impact of stable, healthy families, again, with married two-parent households being sort of a norm we want to restore, but the very important caveat also recognizing that for families that don't look like that, they're still worthy of support. And it's something that you've tried to do through the Office of Families, but do you think that that's sort of a core principle that ought to rally all of us around it? moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, we want to support single parent households, and we want to give them the help and support that they need because we want children to thrive. We want people to be happy. But yes, we all should be rallying around this. I love what the Utah Marriage Commission is doing, some of the things that they're doing to give families that support and, talking about healthy relationships. We need more of that. We need kids to understand what a healthy relationship looks like so that they don't fall into the trap of finding someone who is abusive or not knowing how to recognize some of the warning signs there. And so being able to advocate for healthy relationships, being a champion for marriages, it's so critical for our state.
Well, Aimee, we need to wrap up, but I want to kind of ask you looking forward. We've had you on before. We'll, of course, have you on again with all the important work you're doing here in the state of Utah. But just in case, if we don't have you back before the legislative session starting in January 2024, what do you see on the horizon as what's the big what's next when it comes to how we here in Utah can better support families and help to foster the creation of a higher number and a higher rate of these kind of healthy marriages and healthy families that you're talking about? What's next? What should we be focused on in the next coming months?
Well, I mean, I think we want to recognize that everyone has the choice to make the decisions for their family, who they marry, all of that. And something that the governor's always talked about is that we want to ensure we are supporting their choices, whether it's how they take care of their family during the day, what their needs are, what kind of careers they choose. It's about ensuring that people have the opportunities that they need. And so looking forward to, what opportunities exist for families is going to be critical.
Well, we will watch that closely here at Sutherland Institute and look forward to future conversations. Thanks again for coming in and kind of helping us to frame and elevate sort of this focus on what the Marriage Commission is doing, some of the other efforts here in Utah.
Thanks, Nick.
Well, we're going to take one final break before we leave you with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we let you go, I want to just emphasize really one key takeaway from our conversation about marriage and family and how to strengthen those key institutions here in Utah. And that key takeaway is this: strong families anchored by healthy marriages tend to have a huge impact on a wide array of social and policy issues we see in our state and country. So our public policy discussions ought to center the institution of the family in those dialogues as often as possible. We want to thank our special guests for joining us and helping to articulate that point and equip each of us with the ability to become stronger defenders of the importance of elevating the institution of the family in our public discussions. If you like what you heard today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can find clips from this episode and other episodes to share in your conversations with friends and family. And we hope that you feel better equipped to defend the ideas we talked about today. Lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's it for Defending Ideas this week from Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.